Good morning. I know it's been a little bit since we've talked, and it's been a while since I've read from one of my favorite books, Under God, by Toby and Michael. So I'm going to do that this morning, and I have something very special I want to share with you. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. That's the preamble of the Constitution to the United States of America. I want to read about the Compromise of 1877, and it's titled Turned Loose to the Whirlwind. See if this sounds familiar. With the sitting president not running for re-election, a Republican and a Democrat square off for the job. The last administration is coming off a tidal wave of moral failure, making his party's job of holding the office far more difficult. As well, the nation is becoming increasingly fractious, splitting down party lines on a number of key issues. The election season is contentious and the vote is close, very close, too close in fact to call, at least in the Electoral College. The popular vote anoints a clear winner. However, that's not how we elect a president in the United States. And so, amid charges of voter fraud and election mishaps, in Florida, among other places, the new president isn't so much elected as appointed, and a lot of people aren't happy with the results. This isn't the election of 2000, or the election of 2020, however. It's the election of 1876 between Rutherford B. Hayes for the Republicans and Samuel J. Tilden for the Democrats. One of the clearest examples of American history of how the past quite often repeats itself. The social circumstances surrounding the election and the aftermath, though, teach their own lessons about our country and the difficulty it was having in moving past slavery and recovering from the Civil War. In 1876, Ulysses S. Grant still held the office of president, though most of the country, Republicans and Democrats alike, were tired of him. Corruption ruled during Grant's terms, and the great job of pulling together a fractured nation seemed lost in Washington's clamor for lined pockets and the fight for self-interest. If bribes were going to be paid anyway, they might as well be coming to you. On the national agenda stood the issue of Reconstruction. It was now 11 years since the Confederate Army surrendered, and yet the work was still not done. See if this even sounds familiar. When a war, which seems to have been started for just reasons, ends, the winning nation finds itself faced with a land torn in two. On one side stand the liberated, who have never been in power, land, or even had basic human rights. On the other side are the conquered forces who see that someone coming in and telling them how to run their nation. Worse, they're now expected to just accept edicts from the country that just defeated them, allow a population of men and women they hate to live free, and submit to it all under threat of military action. There has never been an easy or simple solution to such problems. There isn't one today, and there wasn't one back in 1866. Union troops roamed the South. Southern states were forced to accept new amendments to the U.S. Constitution to be let back into the country, and a powerful Congress overrode President Johnson's veto by passing the Reconstruction Acts, dividing states into military districts. The Freedmen's Bureau, created in 1865, was given the enormous task of tackling the transition at a practical level. The jobs included finding work for freed slaves, setting up schools and educational systems, and much more. The Bureau had the power to enact laws to meet their goals and helped establish new state constitutions and governments for each reconstructed Southern state. Southerners who watched their states be handed over to blacks and newly arrived carpetbagger Yankees hated the Bureau with a passion, and it's not surprising that members were often targeted by a newly emerged Ku Klux Klan. Take all this unrest, let it fester for a number of years, and then add the Hayes-Tilden election of 1876, and you have a rough idea of the state of the country at that time. Angry voices, pointing fingers, and outright threats filled the public discourse. We were still a nation divided. The problem with the election was this. Democrat Samuel Tilden, champion of the white South, had won the popular vote, 4,282,020 to 4,036,572. And the day after the election, the electoral return stood at 184 for Tilden and 165 for Hayes. But the winner needed 185 votes, and 4 states' votes still remained: Oregon, Florida, South Carolina, and Louisiana. Oregon's 3 votes soon went to Hayes, but the other 3 states were a debacle. In the end, under reciprocal charges of voter fraud, both parties produced their own sets of electoral results and sent the results to Washington, D.C. All the numbers contradicted each other, and when the government turned to the Constitution for help, they found none. No manner of resolution for such a problem had ever been spelled out. Days turned into weeks, turned into months. It was now March 1877, and the inauguration, now merely theoretical, was just days away. A bill was passed calling an electoral commission consisting of 5 members of the Senate, House, and Supreme Court to review the election and vote for a winner. There would be 7 Republicans, 7 Democrats, and 1 independent. Shortly after the bill, however, the 1 independent left the Supreme Court for a Senate seat. In filling the remaining spot from the Supreme Court, the commission had no choice but to elect a Republican. There were no Democrats left. The commission's vote 8-7 made Rutherford Hayes President of the United States, but Congress still needed to accept the decision. Securing the majority vote necessary to carry the measure seemed almost an impossibility until a compromise was reached. In the return for accepting Hayes as president, his first task would be to provide more federal funds for rebuilding ruined Southern infrastructure and also to end Reconstruction by officially removing federal troops and recognizing Democrat governors elected to numerous Southern states. The Republicans agreed. Their man took office, but in return for the Republicans' win, the Democrats over the next decade were able to erase most of the civil rights laws that had been passed in the preceding 15 years. And so, among blacks, the Compromise of 1877 became known as the Great Betrayal. The Great Betrayal. The South celebrated as if they'd actually won the war. As Northern troops boarded ships home, Southern citizens fired guns and rang bells. Meanwhile, black citizens, free but unequal, watched in silence. The war that was fought seemed to have been won in vain. They were emancipated, but that freedom now seemed worthless as their rights soon vanished without protection. After the Civil War, Southern states had been forced to accept laws declaring blacks and whites equal, but when the threat of force vanished, segregation became enacted into law with the Plessy versus Ferguson decision calling for separate but equal treatment. And it was easy to ignore the equal part of that ruling. Poll taxes, literacy tests, and brutal force kept blacks from voting. Courts turned a blind eye to justice, often rendering convictions without trials or throwing out complaints made by blacks without even considering evidence, and with the eventual rise of the KKK, segregation turned into something more than separation. It turned brutal and violent. The KKK reigned with terror, and the rope noose struck terror for decades. More than 3,000 blacks would be lynched over the next 40 years, and that doesn't even mark the rip of the mountain of those who were beaten, tortured, abused, stolen from, and treated as insignificant. In many ways, during Jim Crow, a black Southerner's life was arguably worth less now than during slavery. As Frederick Douglass put it, "You have emancipated us. I thank you for it. You have enfranchised us, and I thank you for it. But what is your emancipation? What is your enfranchisement if the black man, having been made free by the letter of the law, is unable to exercise that freedom? You have turned us loose to the sky, to the storm, to the whirlwind, and worst of all, you have turned us loose to our uninfuriated masters. What does it all amount to if black men, after having been freed from the slaveholder's lash, is subject to the slaveholder's shotgun?" There is no denying Douglass's words. The North, tired and frustrated by the political quagmire in which it had become entangled, bailed when expedience called for it. For the sake of the executive office, they traded the burgeoning rights of race of men and women. What might have been won over the next 5 years now took blacks nearly a century. There are no easy answers, but there are certainly bad choices, and the Compromise of 1877 stands as one of the worst in our nation's history. For it compromised very little that affected the people's making of the choices. It wasn't their freedoms they were surrendering, their rights they were chaining down. Our call is to look out for the powerless, not to sell them out for power. As Abraham Lincoln said, whenever I hear anyone arguing for slavery, I feel a strong impulse to see it tried on him personally. We're repeating history right now as we sit here in this past election. And behind the scenes, without there being much fanfare or news being said about it, the election of 2020 is being investigated in many swing states for fraud and what some believe will come to light in the next few weeks. And as is evidenced in what's happening right now in our country, so many of our rights are being challenged. So many of our freedoms, the freedom of choice, the freedom of speech, the freedom to keep and bear arms, the freedom to practice our religion, the basic ideals of one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all, are all being challenged and have been being challenged for many years. So the very foundations that our country are built on are being eroded. And the ideas the idea of the American dream could very soon become nothing more than one of these other countries that have failed, because the idea of the American dream will be no more. I had a dream last night. In that dream, I was in a crowd of people. And on one side of the room, I was here, and there were people all around me, and there was not a stage, but a place where two people were standing. One was the guy named Biden, and he was giving some kind of speech, and the people were yelling and screaming. And then over here came Trump. President Trump walked in the room, and he was like this close walking in. And he was down, his face was down, and he was crying. And the people in the crowd were cheering and yelling and booing and everything. And as he passed and he came closer, I reached out and I wiped the tears from his face. And he looked up into the crowd with this look of humility. And the crowd got quiet. And I felt like that he was definitely there for a reason. I saw compassion in his face. I saw where he cared. And I knew that he was not there to trade the freedom of people for power, but that he was there to do what all leaders are meant to do: serve the people. In what I just read to you, if you will recall, the freedoms that were traded in order to allow for the Republican to become president allowed the Democrats to cause the minorities, the black people who had just been freed, to be segregated. their rights to be taken away. And as the word said in that writing, what should have taken 5 years at the most took a century to get where we are today because of the actions of compromise that allowed the Republican to become president by trading away the freedoms to the Democrats in the southern states to allow for segregation to be in place. That was unacceptable then, and it's unacceptable now. Anyway, I just wanted to bring that message to you this morning that a terrible thing happened. And we are repeating history. Are you a patriot? I am. And I love my country. I love my kids. I love my grandkids. And I do hope, with honesty, omnipotence, and pure love for my essence in my heart, that we take the right and I'm not claiming to be some authority in this. I'm simply a normal guy who learned about our country and has lived in our country. I'm 64 years old next month. And I lived through the 60s and the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. And I've seen what our country went through in those times. And as someone who has gone through that and has seen going from segregation to integration to equality as we have never seen before anywhere in the world, we have to stop the direction we're going in right now. We have to stop the people who are doing what they're doing right now. And I think that dream last night was a message that the person who can get us there needs to be there. And that's all I'm going to say right now. I love you. Goodbye.